On May 18, 1991, 3 Soviet astronauts were preparing to travel to the Mir space station. Before the International Space Station, ISS, several space stations existed, including the Soviet Union's Mir and NASA's Skylab. While Mir belonged to the Soviet Union, it was also used by the United States and Europe. Interestingly, space was one of the few areas where the Cold War rivalry softened. Even today, an American and a Russian astronaut work side by side on the ISS, relying on cooperation rather than conflict. Now let's go back to 1991. That year, 3 astronauts, 2 Soviets and 1 Briton, entered the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, preparing for launch to Mir. They were Anatoly Artsebarsky, Soviet Union; Helen Sharman, United Kingdom; Sergei Krikalev, Soviet Union. Their mission was scheduled to last 144 days before returning to Earth, back to Kazakhstan. However, if you recall, 1991 was the year the Soviet Union was collapsing. Despite the political turmoil, the space program continued. This wasn't the first historic milestone in Soviet space exploration. 30 years earlier, in 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to travel into space. There's a famous story about Gagarin. As he was being transported to the launch site by bus, he realized he needed to urinate. With no time to find a restroom, he relieved himself on the back tire of the bus. This seemingly trivial act became a tradition among cosmonauts, including the 2 Soviet astronauts in this 1991 mission. The rocket launched successfully, and after a few hours, it docked with Mir. The astronauts boarded the station, which was much smaller than the ISS. Living conditions were tough. Astronauts described the station as noisy and having a strong, unpleasant smell due to its outdated filtration system. Despite this, astronauts were thrilled to be there, conducting research and contributing to human spaceflight. Sergei Krikalev, the key figure in this story, spent much of his free time staring at Earth from the station's windows, identifying familiar landscapes and enjoying the breathtaking view. The original plan was for all 3 astronauts to return after 5 months. However, while Helen Sharman returned as scheduled, Artsebarsky and Krikalev had to wait for another capsule. Then, everything changed. The Soviet Union collapses, and Krikalev is left behind. While the astronauts in space carried out their mission, the Soviet Union was crumbling. The once mighty superpower was in chaos, and no one seemed concerned about bringing the cosmonauts home. By August 1991, Soviet republics were declaring independence one by one, including Kazakhstan, where Baikonur was located. This was a major problem because the Soviet Union's primary launch and control centers were in Kazakhstan. After months of political instability, in October 1991, under pressure from Moscow, Kazakhstan launched a capsule to Mir, but it only had space for 1 astronaut. Anatoly Artsebarsky returned to Earth, but Krikalev was left behind. With each passing month, the situation worsened. Krikalev, isolated in the deteriorating Mir station, could only watch from above as the country he represented ceased to exist. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned, officially dissolving the Soviet Union. Krikalev, now belonging to a country that no longer existed, remained stranded in orbit. The last Soviet citizen, Krikallev's condition worsened, psychologically and physically. Being alone in space for months, confined to a noisy, aging station, was mentally taxing. And physically, prolonged exposure to microgravity was taking a toll. In space, bones lose density due to the lack of gravitational pressure, similar to how marine creatures evolved to have lightweight skeletons. Finally, on March 25, 1992, the new Russian government negotiated with Kazakhstan to launch a capsule and retrieve Krikalev. He had been in space for 305 days, far beyond his original mission. Breaking records, defying limits. Krikalev set a record for the longest continuous stay in space at the time. This record stood for 4 years until another Russian astronaut, Valery Polyakov, spent 437 consecutive days in space. Despite the physical and psychological toll, Krikalev didn't retire. He returned to space multiple times, accumulating 803 total days in orbit. Today, Krikalev is a retired astronaut, but he carries a unique title, the last Soviet citizen. While the Soviet Union ceased to exist, he remained in orbit, its final representative in space. Ironically, urinating on the bus tire for good luck didn't seem to help him much. Let us know what you think in the comments.